Judge Frank Caprio was laid to rest on Friday, August 29, 2025, after a long life that touched people far beyond Rhode Island. He died on August 20th, 2025, at the age of 88, after fighting pancreatic cancer. His death brought sadness to his family, to the state he served, and to the many people around the world who had come to admire him. His burial, which took place at St. Anne's Cemetery in Cranston, Rhode Island, was the final chapter in days of mourning that had begun with a public funeral mass. The burial itself was a quieter and more intimate moment than the large funeral at the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul in Providence. That service had drawn crowds of mourners, along with governors, senators, congressmen, judges, clergy, and thousands of citizens. But when the coffin left the cathedral and was carried through the streets of Providence, the focus slowly shifted from public ceremony to private farewell. The procession from the cathedral to the cemetery passed through Federal Hill and Atwells Avenue, the neighborhood where Judge Caprio had been born and raised. Residents, shopkeepers, and families lined the sidewalks to say goodbye. Many held signs of appreciation. Some raised their hands to wave, others made the sign of the cross, and others clapped quietly in respect. For the people of Federal Hill, this was more than the passage of a funeral cortege. It was the homecoming of one of their own, a boy from the neighborhood who had risen to national fame without ever forgetting his roots. The decision to bring the procession through Federal Hill was symbolic. Judge Caprio often spoke about his childhood in a cold water flat, about shining shoes on Atwells Avenue, and about helping his father deliver milk before dawn. He credited those early struggles with teaching him hard work, compassion, and resilience. For the people who watched from the sidewalks that day, the passing hearse was a reminder that even those who achieve global recognition never stop belonging to the place where they began. When the procession reached St. Anne's Cemetery in Cranston, the scale of the event became smaller. The cemetery, known as the final resting place of many Italian-American families, became the stage for the last farewell. Judge Caprio, the son of Italian immigrants, was laid to rest among people who had shared similar journeys of migration, labor, and family devotion. The choice of St. Anne's carried deep meaning. It placed him not only beside family, but also within the wider story of Rhode Island's immigrant community, a story he had often recalled in interviews and speeches. At the Graveside, Catholic priests led the burial prayers. They recited the traditional words asking that God grant rest to his servant and receive him into paradise. Holy water was sprinkled on the coffin, and incense rose as a sign of reverence and hope. The final prayers spoke of the resurrection and the promise of eternal life, words meant to comfort the living as much as to honor the dead. Those present at the burial were mostly his family and closest friends. His wife of 62 years, Joyce, stood by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. His sons, who had spoken emotionally at the funeral mass, were again beside their father at this last moment. His granddaughter Sophia, who had called him her hero, joined the family circle. They surrounded the coffin, united in grief and gratitude, repeating the lesson he had given them. Family comes first. Although the burial was private, the presence of a few judges and clergy showed the respect he had earned in Rhode Island's legal and religious circles. These were not officials attending in a formal role, but friends and colleagues who had walked alongside him in his long career. Their attendance reflected the deep personal connections he had built over decades of service. Military honors marked another part of the burial. Judge Caprio had served in the Rhode Island National Guard, and the Guard was present at St. Anne's to pay tribute. The American flag was folded with care and presented to his widow, Joyce. That gesture linked his early years of service with his later decades of public duty. It showed that his contributions were not limited to the courtroom, but extended to the defense and well-being of the country. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, silence fell over the family. This act, simple yet final, closed the circle of his earthly life. The man who had once spoken about the long, bumpy road of life was now at rest, his journey completed. For those standing at the graveside, the moment carried both sorrow and peace. After days of public events and national attention, this was the private act of farewell that only family could share. For Rhode Island, the burial carried larger meaning. The state had flown flags at half-staff, and tributes had come from across the political spectrum. Public officials called him one of the most respected and beloved figures in the state's history. But at the cemetery, attention turned away from public titles and toward the roles that had always mattered most to him: husband, father, and grandfather. His burial showed the two sides of his life: the public man whose decisions and words had touched millions, and the private man whose greatest pride was his family. In the days after the burial, members of the Caprio family spoke about carrying forward his message. They promised to continue his teachings of kindness, compassion, and family unity. His children and grandchildren said that the burial was not just a goodbye, but a reminder of their responsibility to live as he had taught them. For them, his grave at St. Anne's became not only a place of mourning, but also a symbol of commitment to his values. The wider community also found meaning in the burial. For judges and lawyers, it was a reminder that the law can be practiced with mercy. For immigrants and working-class families, it was proof that someone from humble beginnings could rise to prominence without losing touch with his roots. For ordinary viewers who had watched his courtroom clips online, it was a moment to honor a man who had shown that authority can be exercised with humanity. Unlike the funeral mass, which was broadcast live and watched by thousands around the world, the burial was not televised. This choice reflected the balance that had marked his life. While his courtroom work had become global, his personal life remained grounded in Rhode Island and centered on family. The decision to keep the burial private was consistent with his belief that some things belong only to those who share daily love and life. Still, the impact of the burial extended far beyond the cemetery. News reports described it as the close of an era for Rhode Island. Citizens who had lined the streets spoke of feeling proud to have lived in the same community as Judge Caprio. Messages poured in from across the world, with people writing that his burial was not just a local event, but a global farewell to a symbol of kindness. At St. Anne's, the words of one of his earlier speeches seemed to echo. Years before, he had told an audience that when the book of life is closed, people are not judged by what they take, but by what they give. That idea became the frame for his burial. Those present did not speak of the offices he held or the honors he received. They remembered instead what he had given: compassion in court, hope to strangers, and devotion to family. In the end, the burial of Judge Frank Caprio was both simple and profound. It was simple because it followed the ordinary steps of a Catholic burial: prayers, blessings, and interment. But it was profound because of who he was and what he represented. A boy from Federal Hill, the son of immigrants, had traveled a long road to become a national figure, and yet he returned finally to rest among his family and community. His burial closed a chapter in Rhode Island's story, but also opened a challenge to those who remain. It asked them to continue his example of kindness, fairness, and humility. It reminded them that greatness is not measured by wealth or power, but by the lives touched along the way. At St. Anne's Cemetery, as the final prayers ended and the family turned away from the grave, that message became his lasting gift. Judge Caprio's burial will be remembered as a moment when Rhode Island and the wider world paused to honor not just a judge, but a man who believed in compassion above all else. It was the final act of a life lived with integrity, and it left behind a legacy that will continue to guide both his family and the many who admired him.